Good afternoon, everyone. I am delighted to be joined by a man whose roles are famously eclectic. Political commentator, television presenter, academic, art writer, chef. Have I forgotten any of them?
I wish I could say auto mechanic, but that would be a fantastic lie, actually.
So as a historian, he's explored the defining events of European and American modernity and delved into the lives of people, paintings and landscapes, and most recently, epidemics. In the process, he's become a household name who has created his own brand of animated, energetic historical writing, you can tell I'm a fan, and biographically inflected narration on our TV screens. Everyone, welcome Sir Simon Schama. So, your latest highly acclaimed work is Foreign Bodies.
Right.
Clearly the COVID pandemic had something to do with it, but it would be fascinating to begin by hearing about your deeper motives and inspiration behind the book.
Right, thank you. Yes, it was not the book that my publishers were expecting, it's fair to say. And I was writing a book called Return of the Tribes, which was more in my usual lane, I guess, as is now said, which was about ultra-nationalism. I got interested in what had happened to music in the 19th century, the likes of Glinka and Smetana and Sibelius and so on. Anyway, I was sort of persevering with that, but I had a sort of slight sense under the skin, in a way, that I was sort of not cruising exactly, but I was doing something which I already knew something about. And when the pandemic hit, I felt one piece of me wanted to learn something fresh, but not completely outrageously disconnected from anything I'd done before. But while I was still very much engaged in this book about the comeback of extreme populist nationalism, I was hunting for moments where that wasn't necessarily true, and I thought, okay, well, there had to be when the World Health Organization was founded, and I did know that it was the first specialized agency of the United Nations to be created in San Francisco in 1948, interestingly by two diplomats, one Norwegian and one Chinese. It was an amazing alliance. And I went to the WHO. We were all then stuck with doing our archival work online, but you could do an extraordinary amount. WHO turned out to have a great archival website, and it led me to something which was really weird, with a slightly unappealing title of the International Sanitary Conferences of the 19th century, which were formed initially in 1851 to deal with the great killer of the mid-19th century, cholera. And this was the first international organization that tried to establish some sort of collaboration in the collective interest of deciding whether or not there should be quarantines. I mean, it's very much like the kind of, ancestor of the WHO. And the mover and shaker of that organization suddenly appeared on this archival page as Adrien Proust, and Marcel Proust's father. So it wasn't, then I really sat bolt upright, and I knew he was a doctor, but a doctor who was the father to the most hypochondriac person in all of literature, really, and a sort of figure of ridiculous pomposity, as he sometimes appears in Marcel's writing. Though, as I discovered, there's much more interesting affectionate bond between them, particularly later in his life. And he turned out to be a radically interesting person. And I think actually, you may have a kind of plan to do. I was listening to Marlon James talk so brilliantly and inspiringly earlier on, and he was really saying that projects sometimes push you into a shape you hadn't intended to go. I think often the same thing can happen with non-fiction. So it was a sort of sense in which this provincial become Parisian doctor stalking through the horrifying wards of the cholera sick, but also someone who thought that we would never be able to contain cholera unless you went to the hottest of hot zones, which turned out to be the area of the borderland between Russia and Persia and what's now kind of Azerbaijan, around the north of the Caspian Sea. And sure enough, he went there, and you could track his journey. So I was kind of led by this story of the person who understood. There was a debate, not to be too long-winded about it, moi, surely not, a debate about those who understood what cholera was. The actual pathogen wasn't isolated and identified till the 1880s, and there was a debate about whether or not essentially the pathogen remained contained in a particular site, as famously in John Snow discovered it, the source of the terrible cholera outbreak in London to be a particularly infected pump in what's right round the corner from my TV agent right now, actually. No connection in any other way. Yes, near Lexington Street. And therefore all you needed to do was throw massive disinfection at it. And those who, in Britain in particular, had an interest in not imposing any obstructions to business. Does this sound familiar? Against people like Marcel Proust, who said, yes, and without any sense of, pathogenic transmission scientifically, really, although when he learned it many decades later, he became a great champion of the new science. Adrien Proust said, well, the microbe can be carried on contaminated upholstery in a carriage going around Paris. He traced routes of cholera sickness, certainly on the upholstery of railway trains, no loos at that time, steamboats, and so on. So he believed that cholera was contagious, not if two people in a room, if they just stood, talked to each other. No, not contagious. Shook hands could easily be, really. So he necessarily threw himself into these epic journeys, and every 2 or 3 years assembled delegates who would in other worlds have been diplomats or military experts, but they were interested in the possibility of international public health. And that really, I didn't at that point think, my wonderful wife who's sitting here in front is a scientist. So at that point I said, look, as you well know, I have a raging imposter syndrome anyway, really. Is this really going to set new records for outrageous imposterness, if that's a word? And she said, well, it could be, but, but do it anyway. No, she shouldn't say that. She was incredibly encouraging. And so it sort of formed, gradually it formed. I got very interested as the pandemic tightened its grip. Obviously, I got interested in the history of vaccination. And I felt that a story about the way of waves of infectious diseases was a sort of social story. It's a story of persuasion. When I went back to the 18th century story of smallpox and what was done about inoculation for smallpox 100 years before Edward Jenner, a century before Edward Jenner, you immediately understood what a counterintuitive thing it was to ask people to actually put into their own body a small amount of the matter that was killing people. You took pus from somebody who got smallpox and abraded your arm or your leg or your forehead or sometimes between your toes or made cuts, little incisions. And what was sort of really huge leap of faith that would have to be. So the book is, the book is really about the conquest of that kind of instinctive improbability in the name of acquired empirical truth, in other words, scientifically earned truth.
But there are also lots of fabulously fascinating characters, which is a couple of questions about one of them. One of the book's greatest heroes is Valdemar Haffkine, I hope I've said that right, who wasn't just developing vaccines, but as you said, he was persuading people to accept them. What do you think Haffkine has to tell us about how to handle contemporary crises of skepticism and conspiracy?
Well, I'll try not to keep it too long, fat chance for that. But
because we still got to get to Mary Whatley Montagu.
Do you want to talk about Mary first? Because she was a persuader.
Well, talk about.
She's a persuader.
She's an extraordinary woman.
She is an absolutely extraordinary
Do you want
person.
to talk her?
I would, if that's all right.
Yeah.
I think actually she is in the vanguard. She is the great promoter of the success of smallpox inoculation. When I guess it was measurably so. 1 in 6 people died of smallpox. It was a kind of new disease. It only arrived as the Black Death was ebbing at the late 17th century, and it was absolutely terrifying. And if you survived smallpox, you were disfigured with hundreds of scabs, and you were very badly disfigured as she was. She was nearly killed by smallpox in 1715. Her brother had died of it. And you could go blind. There are lots of cases of survivors having gone blind. Not quite sure how that worked, but that was undoubtedly true. And she's the wife of the British ambassador in Constantinople in the second decade of the 18th century. Edward Wortley Montagu, a man with whom she'd eloped, a romantic marriage, which the romance lasted about 5 minutes, really, actually. But there they were in Constantinople, and she noticed, actually, in the Ottoman Empire, that women in particular, because she had been a famous beauty, she was a published poet, she was a friend of Alexander Pope and Congreve and John Gay, and she was a known literary celeb, really. And she noticed that, and had been a famous beauty and was no longer, and she noticed that the women in particular, but everybody, seemed to have no scars at all. That aroused her interest in particular. And she inquired, and she was told that she was informed about this practice of inoculation, later called variolation, but everybody at the time called it inoculation. And she had her 6-year-old son, also called Edward, inoculated by an elderly Greek lady. The very nervous Scottish doctor called Charles Maitland at the embassy was brought in, slightly horrified. I mean, he was prepared to believe in inoculation, but he thought it was done a bit brutally and a bit clumsily, and the little boy did cry a bit. And he was fine. He had a slight fever. He had just 3 or 4 scabs. They all fell off. He did very well. So when she got back to England, she was already knew the then Princess of Wales, who became Queen Caroline Ansbach to George II. And she had her 3-year-old daughter inoculated, and then ran a promotional campaign for inoculation, but ran into an absolute storm of hostility from the clergy, who said, it's in God's hands who shall live and who shall die, and what kind of mother would actually give their perfectly healthy child a dose of smallpox.
Well, it seems counterintuitive. Actually, there's a Cliveden connection between Mary Wortley Montagu and...
Tell me about that.
So she persuaded Princess Augusta, who was married to Frederick, to inoculate her children, which was a huge leap of faith at the time. And actually, Augusta was very much ahead of her time to do it, because it was, as you said, terrifying.
The book has what interests me as well. I mean, that story about Mary, who was incredible and so brave and correct in what she was doing. But the Royal Society, what was part of the attack on her was, which gave me the idea of the slightly clumsily punning title, is that, people did not take kindly to being told what to do. One of them, a physician, William Wagstaff, famously said, posterity can scarcely believe that the profession of doctors would be... I'm going to get it wrong, so I better just stop and paraphrase it. Posterity can scarcely believe, actually, that we would heed the instruction of a scarcely literate tribe of women, because the women have been doing the inoculation. So she had, both as a woman and the sense in which this was a folk wisdom coming from the Middle East, coming from Turkey and North Africa and Syria, and as was discovered later, there were Brahmin inoculators in India. So what was extraordinary about that moment, I thought, when I was writing it, was that the Royal Society, however, was enormously open to actually discovering whether or not inoculation worked. And networks of doctors in the provinces, there's one in particular, Thomas Nettleton, who worked in and around Halifax in Yorkshire, who literally did house-by-house street survey, who had been inoculated, who had not, people living in almost identical. It's a kind of intuitive, rough version of a kind of randomized trial. And the Royal Society acts as a clearinghouse, and we're in 1720, 1721, really early. And it's only happening really in the Middle East and in a systematic way in England. French are much, much more resistant to it.
But going back to Lady Mary, is there a story of gender in inoculation? I mean, you know,
sure.
250 years ago there was Lady Mary, and then there was Sarah Gilbert.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, what struck me all the way through there were real, and I wasn't searching, but I certainly wasn't going to underplay it as well. There are women all along. There's a woman called Alice Courthorne. When Natalie very kindly was, I'll talk about Hafkin in a second, but he ends up creating vaccine against cholera, and a vaccine against bubonic plague, when both are a really horrific problem in late 19th century India. And there are a whole group of women, some of them associated with the training of Indian women doctors, because it was actually, particularly when bubonic plague happened, no respectable family, as they thought of themselves, would consent to have men examining bodies for signs of buboes, which first appear in the groin and in the armpits. So the Queen Victoria actually was also a huge enthusiast of creating Indian women doctors, but the possibility of women actually entering fully into the medical profession happens from the 1860s, 1870s onwards. And what is remarkable is about how a number of those, not only when they battle their way through really vicious male hostility to women being doctors at all, how many of them then decide to actually, go to places like India and Malaya and Hong Kong and so on. And this woman, Alice Courthorne, was extraordinary. There's a photograph of her and her vaccination buggy, vaccinating against bubonic plague in the area of the region of the Carnatic in southwest India. And she vaccinates, we know. I mean, Hafkin was extremely proud and fond of her. 2,000 people a day. She was the record vaccinator, actually. And she's in a situation of constant danger, but she knew that she had to really represent her fully as someone who, as a woman, had a particular tender solicitousness for the welfare of children, but of everybody, particularly children. So she gave lectures with an Indian translator in working class areas of the town she went to, and for a while to what was then Bombay as well. And then there'd be vaccinators standing by, actually, to vaccinate people who were prepared to be vaccinated.
So
she thought through it. Yeah, absolutely. No, the resonances with what happened in COVID are very strong, including the paranoia and suspicion. And I mean, behind the whole project, as the project got going and seemed to me, to sort of take shape as a book, was this profound paradox of where we all are, everyone, that we're both a kind of at a historical moment where humans are capable of such stunning scientific, ingenuity is not quite the right word, investigative brilliance, really, is to be able to come up with a vaccine, messenger RNA vaccine, in an extraordinary period of time. But we're also a kind of human society which is sort of riddled with, barely evolved paranoid suspicion, conspiracy theories, and hostility. We have two people currently running for president of the United States, Robert Kennedy Jr., who still insists that childhood vaccines against measles, mumps, and rubella causes autism in children, when that theory
there's no scientific...
No, it was debunked 12 years ago. And we have Ron DeSantis running the governor of Florida for the Republican nomination as an anti-vaccine candidate.
So, I mean, when I first looked at this book, I thought this is a radical departure for you.
Right.
But actually, what's amazing about Foreign Bodies is it's distinctly Schama-esque, because you do your amazing blend of culture, science, epidemiology, which cross-pollinate certain historical disciplines, which is very much something that I think a genre that you pioneered, you were at the vanguard of. Are there any remaining silos that you feel could benefit from a Schama-esque cross-pollination?
Oh, so I sort of prescribe to, let's say, historians of submarine warfare?
Exactly.
You know, no, Natalie, actually, no, I wouldn't dare to do so. And I don't think of myself, honestly, I mean, it's so kind and generous of you to sort of think of me as a kind of reinventor. I've never thought of myself like that. I thought of myself, you know, often as a kind of throwback to kind of close narration. And it's true, when I wrote The Embarrassment of Riches and was working on this kind of cultural history of the Netherlands, I read a lot of anthropology. I read a lot of hardcore art historical theory. If any of you want to feel virtuous for no particularly good reason, I recommend you read Hegel on art, actually, and you'll come out older and possibly wiser, but that's not guaranteed. So I did an awful lot of that. But I mean, I hadn't really thought. I don't think, you know, that there will never be, touch wood with any luck, a school of Schama writing.
Oh, I think that already is. I think
really?
I think you're being too modest.
I'd have to tell people to get a life.
On to one of the other great hands. You're a huge Dickens fan, and you've perfectly described the dancing riot of his sentences, their bounding exuberance, if not the best, then the heartiest writer of English prose there has ever been. How much have your influence and tastes evolved over the years?
Oh, that is a good question.
Thanks.
I think that they're all good, Natalie. No, that wasn't meant to sound condescending. I think, well, the Dickens thing, let me go back. You know, my father was very largely self-educated. He left school at 14 or 15, no later than 15. But he was mostly autodidact, and he was an obsessive Dickensian. He used to read to my sister and I at tea time on Sundays from Dickens, playing all the parts. He was the scariest Magwitch ever. And when he finally saved up enough money to have his first seaside holiday in Brighton, and on the way to Victoria, I think it was, Victoria Waterloo, I think it was Victoria Station, there was a barrow boy just not far from the station selling a complete set of Dickens. And my dad traded in the money to buy the Dickens and took them back to Stepney and started on Pickwick Papers. And I think, and that kind of, you know, so I now have most of those books. And I think what I felt about Dickens, partly from my dad's, my mother was a very good storyteller too. But both of them sort of believed in the in exuberance, really, and expansiveness. So their go-to people were also, apart from Dickens, my father was Rabelais and Balzac. He very unusually had complete set of the Comedy Humaine in English. So they believed, they weren't, again, Marlon was talking about this morning, that certainly when I went to school in the 1950s and 60s, Dickens was almost banned, actually, because he was not part of the Leavisite great tradition. So you remember this, that we were taught Shakespeare, yes, okay, which was odd, because Shakespeare, God knows, is sort of explosively abundant and extravagant, and Jane Austen, George Eliot, and Dickens was thought to be a kind of vulgar, lurid, kind of low entertainer, not least because, you know, he did all the books in series, but also because of this kind of wild jumble of extravagant musical-like voices, which is, of course, one of the absolutely great things about Dickens. So I remember my school teacher, one of the school teachers at Haberdashers in the 50s, he said, well, we're allowed to read Hard Times, you know, the only boring Dickens novel I think there is. So I did secret Great Expectations with my dad at home. But what I feel about a lot of very great fiction writing, which has a lot to teach non-fiction writers, is, again, it's sort of almost sensuous overload, it's freedom. So also my dad, one of the few people I know, you know, when I was really a teenager, who knew about Lawrence Sterne and who, again, loved Tristram Shandy and all its indirectness and madness. And there was a sense, I think it came from my father knowing Yiddish and growing up with a very powerful sense of Jewish tradition and Jewish literature, and he loved Sholem Aleichem, for example, and at the same time being an absolutely religiously fanatical Shakespearean and Dickensian, and the sense actually that there wasn't, there may be out there somewhere lurking to be, that comes out of, I don't know, Gawain and the Green Knight, something authentically rooted in a kind of ferocious way. He liked Milton too. Milton was also a no-no to the Leavesites. He liked the kind of operatic wildness, really, that the English writing could generate. And when you're writing non-fiction, when you're a historian, you think, we were taught many things which I then proceeded not to abide by. Presentism, never actually pay attention, never create a project out of what ails you in your contemporary life and project it back into the past, because then it's a kind of echo chamber of your own contemporary obsessions. And I thought, well, no, Thucydides did that as a protagonist in the Peloponnesian War. Machiavelli did that. So I never quite bought into the horror of presentism, hence not being embarrassed about foreign bodies or landscape of memory. And the other thing was that, first of all, write like other historians, really. I mean, make sure that you have a kind of scholarly modesty and decorum. Decorum's not a great thing, really. It should be, probably, for me. But I would certainly never tell a student to kind of, and this sort of sense of obligation to kind of, I remember actually Jack Plum, my great teacher at Christ, Natalie's college as well, quoting, E.M. Forster, who himself was altering Kipling. And Forster said, "What do they of history know who know only other historians?" And I think that's actually true of writing. So when you go back to some of the great classics, Gibbon, for example, or Jules Michelet in France, or kind of crazy Carlyle, I mean, Carlyle, knew Dickens and helped him with Tale of Two Cities. And they are all astonishingly original, powerful voices who break all the rules to try and throw you into the middle of the lives of the people who animate the arguments, which are entertained there.
So, bringing me on to, we've had Schama as a writer. Now I want to move on to Schama as a TV star. I'm sure everyone here is tuned in to one of your shows. What are the challenges of creating that exciting narrative on TV, and how did you learn to adapt screenwriting from the page to the screen?
Right.
What about the two skills is transferable, and what did you have to acquire?
Not a lot is transferable, actually. The worst thing you can do is to delude yourself. I don't know, is Simon Seaback here, who will back? No, he's not. He will, I think, back me up in this. But the worst thing you can do is to sort of imagine that you're supposed to be televising my book or my chapter. It absolutely doesn't work like that. For all kinds of reasons. I mean, you're very much in keeping with what I just said about kind of abundant writing. Which often involves, describing the weather on a particular day or the sounds of a street or something like that. That's a redundancy in television, in a way. Speaking of weather, again, you sometimes have amazing opportunities in writing. In Citizens, when I was working on the French Revolution book, I discovered a particular observer of the French Revolution who was really interested in almost nothing except the weather. And every single day he wrote about whether it was sunny or raining.
Well, again,
or
another
anything.
Outlier ahead of his time.
Yeah, exactly. So in television, actually, you have to really learn what a television hour is like. You have to understand a narrative arc. The most imperative thing, which I suppose is true of writing history as well, you have to really find the wiring between argument and storytelling. Argument without storytelling is just polemics, or it's just really it's a professor's lecture. But storytelling without argument is just anecdote, really, as well. And so, it happens in all great history writing that you find a way, really, to marry them up. When you're making an hour of television, it's a matter of timing, and a lot of what happens which works or it doesn't work happens in the edit afterwards. So I did feel, I had a sort of not great baptism of fire in television. Twice I made 2 little films about Rembrandt. This would have been 1990, I think, 1981, with a director called Nick Rossiter, and called Rembrandt, the Public Eye and the Private Gaze. And I remember Nick phoning me up. We were then living outside Boston, and in a state of panic. And he'd had copious notes, and we'd really blocked out what we were trying to do. And he was driving, I was flying to Holland, and he was driving on the Harwich ferry, and he called me in an absolute panic. His car, the distributor head or something in the electrics of the car, had conked out somewhere I think it was on the Holloway Road, in fact, I'm sure it was. And and it shows you directors aren't always, competent in all areas. He'd simply got out of the car. He'd seen a garage opposite. He'd got out of the car and to sort of see whether they could help, and then watched as someone drove off with the car. There was actually a camera in the car. And he was gifted in lots of ways, but he would also phone one up at 2 o'clock in the morning to denounce one for the previous day's pieces to camera. So that wasn't a great start. And then there was Landscape and Memory, where there were 5, which survived somewhere, I think, and I think moments of it were okay. But Landscape and Memory is a book really about the mind as much as it is about, but it is about nature, and the budget did not really extend to do much exterior filming. So I listened, I was still very green, I listened and said, well, let's make a sound stage at Twickenham Film Studios with Tank. And and we can project on a scrim. And someone said, oh, you remember the beginning of Fellini's Casanova, which you go across the lagoon, but it's actually all black plastic rubbish bags, and that'd be great. It wasn't great. And it's the only time, actually, during filming, I've actually hit someone.
Who did you?
He was a stills photographer. I was on the top of a fake mountain, doing mountains. Yeah, and I don't have a good head for heights. Caroline's laughing, she knows. And I'm sitting, and I've also there's lots of, is it liquid nitrogen? The smoky stuff. I'm not familiar. And I'm trying to invoke Ruskin and this small man climbs up the mountain and says, can I do a still photograph now? I said, no, wait for me to finish. And he says, no, I must do it now. So it turns out, if you hit the lens, it can break someone's nose, actually. I don't think I broke it, but it did gratifyingly bleed. And then filming was abandoned. We were waiting for lawyers to be called. So this was not a fabulous start.
Yeah, but you've gone on to do something.
I did. Well, there were two things I want to say. History of Britain. I kept on thinking, our children were small, and we thought, it's going to break up their school life and so on. And the BBC in those days said, well, and I kept on saying no to it because I thought I knew it would devour our life. It was going to be 16 parts, ended up as 15. But I remember my dad, old dad, one of the wisdoms of my dad was you always regret the things you don't do. And I've been going around ranting and raving about how there needed to be a connection between the scholarly world of history, research and writing and popular communication. And again, what are they of history? No. So I thought, this is an incredible thing I'm being offered, really. And we brought all the family over to London. They went into the American School at London in Loudon Road, about which our very high-minded daughter was quite critical of the teachers, really. And that was really... and then I learnt really a lot of lessons on the job. And the early episodes of History of Britain, which still runs, and I mean countless people, it's been really one of the most indelibly rewarding things. A number of families have come up to me and people have said, my son or kids have said, I got interested because of this. And at the beginning, I over-rate, really. There was one wonderful moment in the first filming in Bath, in the baths at Bath, and it was raining, so the rain came down and created this beautiful mist, gorgeous romantic mist on the... But I was poised in this ridiculous way, which I sort of on a kind of parapet over the water. And just before filming, I'd noticed, you always go when you go filming, you know this, Natalie, there's a kind of health and safety document. And I happened to look at it as the rain was falling on it, and it said, nature of danger, falling in Bath, worst case, cerebral meningitis, persons at risk, presenter. So I'm tottering a bit on my being not fabulously famous for my, coordination. And the cameraman, lovely Luke Cardiff, is on the other side of the bath. And I go, in the 2nd century AD, the bath. And he said, we can hear you perfectly well, Simon. You're all mic'd up. And so there were learning lessons like that. And it started to come together in a less kind of crazily projected, you don't want to lecture, sort of 3 or 4 programs into. And I worked with a really wonderful director called Claire Bevan, who did the Beckett and Henry II film and the Elizabeth Mary Queen of Scots, and then the last one called The Two Winstons. And Claire had a philosophy which was fantastic, really, of less is more. So, for instance, we began, I knew that the Elizabeth Mary Queen of Scots program was called The Body of the Queen because it was all about, can you produce an heir or not? So can you get married or not? What is the Virgin Queen and so on. So I discovered again, sometimes anecdotal things. This works brilliantly for television. It can become visually, dramatically arresting objects, really, which you film. Elizabeth I had a ring, like a wedding ring, which was the ring which she believed betrothed her to her people, not to her husband. And then when she died, it had to be filed off her. Her fingers had swollen. And so I thought, that's fantastic. We actually begin at the end. And we did indeed find a kind of brass ring, or maybe it was gold. And what you see at the beginning of that film are the filings actually flying into darkness.
God, it's an occupational hazard working on one of your sets.
Oh, are you kidding? Yeah, no, I was famous for causing physical calamities. I mean, we had a helicopter crash in West Africa when we were filming. My son is the only person who really thought I really made it when halfway down a column of the page of the Daily Mail it said, Schama cheats death. He thought that was very, very cool.
Thank God for all of us, you did. So you have made history accessible to everyone through your TV shows, through your books. If you were made history czar, if you were responsible for how history was going to be taught in schools, what changes would you make?
Well, I think that, I think particularly in the early years, but I think that element, what's happened to history, and it's actually in the United States where we live, it's happened to teaching of English as well, to literature. So it's become a kind of civic obligation, really. And, writing history and reading it and teaching it does have a relationship to the understanding of citizenship in a democracy. There is no doubt about that. On the other hand, sometimes both literature and history are nailed to a kind of Procrustean bed of collective self-improvement, really, civic improvement. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. But what I want to say in reply to your question is that my history teachers, both at school and university, but especially at school, were fantastically good storytellers. You have to feel, if you're 12 years old, you have to know what it was like to be in the presence of Nelson Mandela or Oliver Cromwell, or baddies as well as goodies, really. They have to find a way, and these great teachers did, of transporting you into a place of past time. I mean, one historian at Cambridge wrote about, he said the poetic magic of history exists in the following paradox. So on the one hand, the people long since dead are just like us. And on the other hand, they are utterly and incommensurably not like us in the way in which they went about their daily life and so on. And you must kind of touch that, sort of magic thing where you're both connected and they are both kind of magically remote as well. So they're exciting, really, and strange in their remoteness. And I think actually you have to do that when you're, all again, the really wonderful history writers I know and love, both past and present, manage that in some way. No. I'm sure many of them have appeared here, of course. But they do that extraordinary, it's not a trick exactly, but it is a sort of, listening to that. It's like ventriloquism or a seance or something. And you have to be, there's a great archive of Valdemar Havkin, the Ukrainian Jew who goes to India and has these epic odysseys of thousands of miles vaccinating the poorest of the poor. And because, again, there was a lot of archival material online, not all of it, his personal papers were in the National Library of Israel in Jerusalem. He became a religious Jew in his middle age. I absolutely came to feel I knew what it would like to have him to dinner, or he was both passionate and very shy. Part of him was very repressed and sublimated. Still don't really know whether he never married. He wrote a kind of weird little romantic micro-novel chapter in Russian, but people told me about the plot, didn't sound very promising. I don't know if he was gay or asexual, but in every other respect, I knew what it was like to sit and listen to him, and that is sort of, again, like I think fiction writing in a way, that you have to be in the almost tangible presence of the people you're dealing with. When I did Citizens, again, which was, French Revolution in its bicentennial year, immensely polemical subject, I knew above all there was one human subject really at the heart of that whole book. And that was what it was like to go from a private life, a non-political life, into the dangerous maelstrom of politics. Was it more dangerous for you and people you loved and admired, never mind about liberty, equality, fraternity, those grand abstractions, was it more dangerous to keep your life private, or was it much more dangerous to absent yourself so you could be accused of one of the things you could be arrested for under the Jacobin terror was being, quote, a moderate, literally a modéré. So you had to make these fine calculations all the time. And running through that book is people terrified they've made the wrong gamble, really. Whatever they believed or whatever they didn't believe, how could they keep themselves and the world around them as safe? That's why, Hilary Mantel's rather wonderful novel about the French Revolution called Place of Greater Safety. So you have to, in some sense, be in that world, again, without being too naively romantic about it, even when you're doing non-fiction, if it carries conviction.
So you just mentioned cooking one of your characters' dinner. You are a wonderful cook.
I don't know. I enjoy it. I enjoy it.
Yeah, I've listened to your podcast.
Oh, yeah, I did the podcast.
If you were in the kitchen and you could invite a whole, dinner party
wow.
of people you've written about from your canon, who would you invite?
From people I've written about.
Who would you have round the table?
Oh boy.
Let's make it a Friday night dinner.
A Friday night. So, wow, does it have to be a Friday night kosher dinner?
No, it doesn't have to
otherwise
be
it'd be almost nobody,
nice
really.
Family,
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
A Friday night dinner. Very good. Well, I suppose, I'd want fun people, really. So I think before he went tragic, I would quite like Oscar Wilde. I'd certainly, and so these people I've not written about, actually, but I'm allowed to have people I've not
you can have
anyone.
But
I will, Oscar, I will. No, I probably won't. Then, I don't know, Colette, I think I love Colette as a writer, really. Fabulously charismatic, alluring, difficult. I mean, difficult in the sense she could turn on you, really tigress writer. I would have to have the extravagant Charles Dickens, I think. Of historians, I probably would invite Gibbon for his jokes in the hope that they would, to get to the Gibbon's jokes takes about a paragraph, actually, but they're often in the footnotes. So I would quite like him to, there we go, that's already quite...
What's your signature dish?
Do I have a signature dish? I do, none of them would like this, I think, actually. I'd have to persuade them. But one thing I do love doing, I mean, there are staples in our family, because I make them staples. There's a Moroccan chicken stew I do, which is also a Moroccan Jewish chicken stew, with preserved lemon, actual lemons, turmeric, chickpeas are very crucial, bashed cardamoms, and a little bit of onion at the bottom, bit of garlic, not too much. And you just gently simmer that sucker for about an hour or so. And it is a voluptuous thing, really.
Yeah, I'm definitely coming for dinner if I'm invited. I've got time for one more question, then I'm going to open it up. In a sliding door scenario, if you weren't Simon Schama, the historian, what would you have been? How would you?
Oh, wow.
Because you're a big football fan.
Yeah, no, I am, but I have no pretensions to be, a centre forward, that's for sure, or anything else. I would have probably been an out-of-work actor, actually, a ham actor. Again, my dad, bless him, he really wanted to go into the theatre, and his father wouldn't let him. And then he became friends with a lot of people around Guthrie and Ralph Richardson, a lot of people in the theatre, and he took us, my sister and I, and my mother, when she was willing, to the theatre a lot. I mean, at least once a week, very often. And the first time I went to, the first theatre I remember was seeing Richard Burton as Henry V at the Old Vic. But the condition was that I learnt the Henry the speech before Harfleur. I was 10, off by heart. And I remember standing, sort of shouting once more to the breach, dear friends, holding my mother's broom, really, to her horror. And I repeated this stellar performance at the school, Wessex Gardens Primary School concert. And I could see my parents right in the middle. And my father was just sort of smiling so hard his ears would practically drop off. My mother was just beetroot with horror and embarrassment, really. So
I'm sure
I've probably been a bad actor.
Proud.
A bad actor.
So we've got a little bit of time for some questions. There's a lady.
Of the TV series that you produced, have you got a favourite?
That's very hard. I'm incredibly lucky. The BBC really gives me a go at doing... I mean, they don't know whatever I want. We have to argue. I did love doing the history of Britain. I mean, the last programme called The Two Winstons, Claire and I sat there and we did it all together. We colour mixed together and did the sound mix together. And I did think we really kind of cracked it at them. But I loved the next series called The Power of Art, which some of you may have seen. And that was really about a crisis, a work of art. There was a crisis for the artist. I love doing that. And we, rightly or wrongly, we won an Emmy for the Bernini film about the ecstasy of St. Teresa in Rome. I love doing the Rothko film. So that was really, I had another life as an art critic. I was New Yorker magazine art critic at the time. So I like that very much. I've just been very lucky. I mean, I did enjoy doing the series which was broadcast last year, was it? Called The History of Now. Which, I appear Zelig-like. And that's a very different kind of television, actually. It's much more informal and immediate and personal. And we're about to start work on a history about culture, conflicts, and so on in Britain since the last war.
Do the crews still need to watch out for you? Or have you got...
Yeah, well, lest I lead them not necessarily into helicopter crashes. Oh, you mean lest I fall off the edge?
Yeah,
pretty much. I'm sort of, Yeah, I'm an extra hazard to any television shoot, yeah.
Oh gosh, I think I saw
Yes,
you
hi,
first.
thank you. What's the most profound lesson in history that you think we could apply to helping us make sense of the world today?
What was that? I couldn't quite hear that. I'm so sorry.
What do you think is the most profound lesson of history that can help
The
us
most
make
profound
sense
lesson.
of the world today?
Well, I don't think you can. I mean, Mark Twain is alleged to have said history never repeats itself, but it sometimes rhymes. I do think if I can sort of switch the question a bit without, taking liberties with the question, I think if you turn it upside down, historical ignorance is, a really disabling thing. I think actually, a lot of us write our books. Again, I think one of the lessons, I don't set it out quite that polemically, although there is a chapter at the end of the book which is set in the politics of COVID, post-COVID, right now. But one of the lessons is that the science is incredibly important, but so is the kind of art of persuasion, really finding a way of communicating. Again, I speak from the American experience in particular, where there's really very troubling and alarming resistance to vaccination. The take-up of booster vaccines is dramatically low, sort of politicians are making capital out of pretending or purporting to say that if you have to constrain economic activities, whether in a full lockdown or not, you're being somehow deprived of your liberties. So I think there are resonances really, but it was Cicero who said, "Those who do not know from whence they came will not know whither they go," and that I'm absolutely sure is true. We have any number of situations right now. We have this kind of meteor shower of really intense existential crises, whether survival of representative democracy in the United States or in Israel, which is a big distressing concern of mine. We have a crisis we have a climate crisis that my friend Peter writes about so eloquently. We have a crisis in migration, They're all kind of, and we have a biological, epidemiological series of waves of crisis. They're all kind of interlocked. And I think particularly in the case of the first, the survival of democracy doesn't necessarily happen by anti-democrats really storming a parliament, even though what happened on January the 6th was very disturbing. It happens really salami slices, things get changed. The civil service, we were talking about this at lunch today, civil service or the judiciary loses its independence, as this is a threat in Israel. And I think above all, what is in the United States, again, most dispiriting is not the kind of crazies, but the enablers, who all have degrees from fancy universities, who all, in one part of their brain, know that are actually conniving at the corruption and disintegration of a representative democratic system, but go along with it because they smell the kind of juice of populism, that it's a vote getter, that weaponizing, there's such a thing I've written about called the glee of hatred that Donald Trump is a master at mobilizing. And if you get into the sense in which really politics is about owning the other side and making people feel jolly from demonizing other people, we're in profound trouble, and history certainly has lots to say about that.
You mentioned that in the United States, politicians who know better, such as, say, Vivek Ramaswamy or Ron DeSantis and so on, are exploiting anti-vaccine sentiment. Among the people who genuinely believe in that, what do you think the motivation is? As in the people who
genuinely are suspicious of vaccines.
And are being exploited, I suppose.
I'm sorry, so the question is actually about the exploiters or the people who are believers?
The people who are believers. What do you think?
Well, again, I thought talking about going back to the smallpox scenario in the early 18th century, I understood perfectly well. Why? Because it was and is. It certainly was for them without knowing what the immune system was, or how we, no understanding, obviously, of antibodies for another century and a half. It does sort of, in a way, put incredible stress on trust and faith, and listening, simply paying attention to surveys published by the Royal Society of, instead of a 1 in 6 chance of dying from smallpox, it was more like 1 in 50. In fact, it was almost exactly 1 in 50 chance. So not everybody is, a learned correspondent of the Royal Society. So you could sort of understand that. I think what is, I suppose, dispiriting, but on the other hand, entirely understandable, is that people, we think that really the Enlightenment as modernity unfolded, and certainly the philosophes themselves, hope that superstition, credulousness, as well as poverty, ignorance, fear, and, would all be banished. But one thing we've learned, especially from the unexpected dark turn of the internet, is that things that really are fevers of the imagination can be intensified and amplified by the internet. I mean, there was a woman, I've done a lot of talks about foreign bodies, and only once, but maybe a self-selecting audience, in Amsterdam, a woman stood up, very nice woman, I think, and she said, well, Mr. Schama, do you believe in nature then? And I said, I believe in little else. Of course, what she meant, and then it was clear, but I knew what she meant. She meant that natural immunity suffices. You don't, therefore, need any help from virologists. And therefore, if natural immunity does survive and you don't need help from virologists, then somebody is up to something. Pharmaceutical corporations, you don't have to go as far as believing that Bill Gates and George Soros have combined in order to insert 5G chips into your arm, really. But you can, and I said to her, well, natural immunity is incredibly important, but what we don't know yet is whether or not, first of all, how long it lasts, and secondly, whether it works from an ancestral virus, the original COVID-19, through Delta, let alone through Omicron. Very unlikely it doesn't. But scientists I read, I know virologists and know epidemiologists. So and she listened, but she was utterly unconvinced like that. So the challenge really, and it's the same thing with climate science as well. The challenge, people like Donald Trump say it's just weather, really. Why are we so the challenge there is, which has not been, I'm not sure we've risen to the challenge, is really of finding a way of non-condescending, non-patronizing communication to explain that it's in everyone's interest. For example, if you're in a under-vaccinated, low-vaccine area, this happened in South Africa, through no fault of your there, not because everybody didn't believe in vaccines, but because the pharmaceutical companies, there are many reasons, the distribution of the first wave of vaccines was incredibly inequitable, despite the WHO, and therefore Southern Africa became an ideal place for the mutation of variants. That's where Omicron 19 started. So it's, I suppose, as I said, the kind of art of persuasion. Hafkin, one thing he did, I should say, in Bombay, when bubonic plague horrifyingly struck, that bubonic plague killed nearly 30 million people between 1892 and the late 1920s. And it was very, very serious and horrifying in Bombay in 1896, 97, 98, through to about 1903, was to work with religious leaders, with Farha Sassoon, leader of the Jewish community, and particularly with the Aga Khan. The Ismaili community in Bombay was a small community, about 30, 40,000. But the Aga Khan then vaccinated himself in front of his community and his children. Hafkin always made a big deal of vaccinating himself with his new vaccines as well. So you have to think almost theatrically about it, or religiously, as if you're on a pulpit, really. And then that helps a lot.
We are running out of time. I think we've got time for one more question.
It's a lady there.
Oh, hi.
I promise not to talk about or ask you about Ange anymore, but...
Yes, we were having a football talk, yeah.
On the point you were making about the arc of the storytelling and the arc of the argument, when you're reading what you consider to be some of your favourite novels...
Oh, right.
Do you look for the same argument flowing through and therefore a neat short book, or do you like to see your storytelling?
Well, when I'm reading fiction,
lots of arguments.
When I'm reading fiction, I'm not looking for arguments at all. Actually, I mean, I'm letting arguments happen as they do in Dickens and George Eliot and Tolstoy and so on. But I'm actually not looking for arguments. I mean, I'm spellbound by the way in which you're allowed to kind of float through the text and the action and the characters, and that's always, moving and instructive, really.
We are tragically out of time. I wish this could go on for much longer, but Simon will be signing copies of this book in the bookshop, so everyone start queuing now. And I would like to say, on behalf of the Clifton Literary Festival, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me,
and
Natalie.
please come back.
Oh, sure.